everybody, this is Ruth. I'm one of the naturalists at Beaver Creek Reserve. And for today's Trailside Treasure, I was hoping maybe to clear up one of those common names that is used or misused on our trails. I quite often find that people who are talking about the evergreens, the trees that stay green all year, call them all pine trees. Well, that's not quite true. And so for today's Trailside Treasure, I would like to take a look at Wisconsin's 3 native pine trees. If we can identify those 3, it gives us a starting spot for learning to identify the other evergreens. Now, the evergreens generally belong to a group of trees called the conifers. The conifers are cone-bearing and have needle leaves as opposed to the broad flat leaf like a maple or an oak. Most of the time the conifers are evergreen, but there are a few that do drop their needles. An example of that would be tamarack. Wisconsin has 3 native pine trees, and I'd like to learn a little bit about those today and hopefully give you the skills to identify those, and so you can look at a tree and decide, is it a pine tree or is it something else in that evergreen category that I need to try to figure out? The pine trees are easy if you look at the way the needles grow. Pine tree needles are attached to each other. So if there's 2 needles, they'll be joined down here and will stay together even when they're not attached to the tree. On trees like spruce and fir, the needles grow separate from each other and grow straight from the branch. They're not attached to each other like they are on pine trees. Let's go take a look and see if we can figure out Wisconsin's 3 native pine trees. I'd like to start with this big pine tree right here behind me. This is the tree that helped build Wisconsin. If we take a look at the needles, so you can see this cluster of needles is attached together, and then the whole group is attached to the branch. I'm going to pull those off. If we look at that one bundle, we'll notice that there are 5 needles. 5 needles in a cluster is a white pine. The way we were taught to remember that is you spell white, W-H-I-T-E, 5 letters in white, 5 needles in the bundle of a white pine. White pine bark has these deep kind of fissures in it. Once it gets older, it makes these kind of long plates, and these give the tree some, not 100%, but some fire protection, because it's this nice thick bark that will help if a fire goes through quickly. White pines can reach heights of 80 to 120 feet. They might live 200 to 500 years. They grow fairly straight, which makes them desirable for building material. The overall shape of a white pine is kind of almost football shape in my mind. They get tiny, pointy towards the top, kind of wide in the middle, and then the bottoms usually clear out, and so they become tapered down again at the bottom because there's no branches left at the bottom. The white pine tree pine cone is very distinct. It's very long and kind of skinny. This is actually kind of a short one. I have seen the white pine cones that are longer than my hand, so you can get them pushing 7 or 8 inches, but fairly long and skinny. One of the things that make pine cones different from other cones is that the scales, the seeds would have been down underneath these scales. When the cone is closed, it protects those seeds, but the scales themselves are quite woody, and that is typical of a pine tree. On the spruces and firs, the scales on their cones are softer and more flexible, where these are pretty brittle and hard. Now, unfortunately, cities like Chicago and St. Louis were built in the prairies. There's not a lot of trees down there, so they quickly used up their own resources and were looking for new materials to build their homes. Northern Wisconsin was full of the big white pines, and we had all these convenient rivers. Not only could you cut the trees down, you could get them to the markets. I don't know if you're aware or not, but Wisconsin has a continental divide. It kind of divides the state into a northeastern half and a southwestern half. Trees on the northeastern side of the continental divide could be shipped to Chicago, different rivers that empty into one of the two Great Lakes and then come down to the bottom of Lake Michigan and deliver the wood to Chicago. Those of us over here on the western or southern side of the divide, we put our trees into rivers like the Eau Claire, the Chippewa, which eventually get to the Mississippi and then can move further downstream to cities like St. Louis. So Wisconsin trees help build this country. And the fact that the trees were here, along with the rivers, helped decide where our cities were going to develop. This dark scaly tree right here next to me is the trunk of a jack pine, sometimes known as scrub pines. Now here at Beaver Creek, our jack pines are actually fairly large, but unlike the white pines, they usually don't get much taller than about 70 or 80 feet. They tend to be kind of crooked, a lot of times called scrub pine. They're not usually used in building materials, but rather they are more for pulp. If they're used at all commercially, they're used for pulp. The jack pine needle has two fairly short needles, roughly about an inch, a little over an inch, and there's a slight twist or bend to them. If you come visit us here at Beaver Creek, these large jack pines are down on our south trail. If you come and look, you're not going to find smaller jack pines growing underneath them. We haven't had a fire. Jack pines have these really cool little cones, and the cones are called serotinous. So this thing right here is the cone, and you can see it looks like it's all closed up. A serotinous cone is closed. It's held together by resin. It's almost like it's been glued shut. And the only thing that's going to unglue it is heat, and generally heat from a fire. In certain conditions you might get the sun that would be warm enough, but you need it well over 100 degrees, 110 to 120 to make the cone open. And so if a fire comes through, the seeds that are in here, that have maybe been here for years, that have been protected inside of that cone, would then be released. And the fire would have created a perfect growing place for those seeds when they hit the ground. Because jack pine need sun. They don't want to be in the shade at all. White pine can grow under a canopy when they're young, but jack pine need the sun. So jack pine need a cycle of fire. Jack pine typically grow in sandy soils, so we see them kind of in the northern part of our state, especially in what we call the pine barren areas. Red pine gets its name from the reddish color you see on the bark and in the scales when the tree gets larger. Red pine are identified by that reddish color. They have two needles in the bundle, and you'll notice the needles are fairly long. They can reach from 4 to 8 inches or so. Red pine trees' cones are round little jobbers. And again, remember that the pine tree pine cones, the scales are hard and wood-like. Red pine are often planted in Wisconsin as a pulpwood. The red pine works really well in plantations. It resists a lot of the diseases and problems that some of the other pine trees can get. It also has a habit of self-cleaning when planted in fairly close proximity to each other. Self-cleaning means that as the tree grows, the branches on the bottom that no longer get sun will die, but then they fall off. So it gives the tree a cleaner, straighter appearance. Red pines can go 70, 80 feet, all the way up to 200 feet if they're in good growing conditions. They don't get the massive size like a white pine does. So remember, Wisconsin's 3 pine trees. The red pine with the red bark, the round pine cone, and the 2 long needles that are attached in their bundle. White pines with the older trees having that real thick bark, 5 needles in their bundle, W-H-I-T-E, and the long skinny pine cones. And then jack pine, the one with the scaly bark and that closed serotinous cone and the short twisted needles, 2 needles, but short and twisted. Now remember, the spruce and the firs will have 1 needle that grows straight out of the branch. Spruces tend to be picky. If you can take the needle and roll it in your fingers, spruces have round needles. You should be able to roll it in your fingers. Firs and hemlocks and some of the other ones have flat needles. You would not be able to roll it between your fingers. I hope that helped clear up a little bit of confusion you might have had with evergreens and helped you identify Wisconsin's 3 pine trees. Thanks for joining me today. See you next time.
Hi, I'm Eric Keisler, Executive Director for Beaver Creek Reserve. Thanks for watching this great educational video from our staff. To find out more information like this and others, check out our website at beavercreekreserve.org. You can also support us by being a member or donating to our endowment campaign, which is supporting Beaver Creek through this COVID-19 crisis. Thank you